A scream shattered the silent night in the Shun district of Foshan. The home of Madame Zhang Yui was engulfed in a sea of fire. The famously strict matriarch had just decided to disinherit her own grandson, Zhang Linfang, simply because he was deemed a poor student. A week later, she was dead. Was this coincidence just too perfect? Could a simple criticism be enough to turn a grandson into a cold-blooded killer? Or were there other secrets, love affairs, financial entanglements, and resentments silently pushing this tragedy to its breaking point? What lies behind the closed doors of the Zhang clan? Stay with us, and if you also feel a chill from the schemes of the human heart, please like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to uncover more shocking cases. On a sweltering July morning in 1998, in the Shun district of Foshan City, Guangdong Province, the usual tranquility of the affluent residential area was torn apart by the frantic, blaring sirens of fire trucks. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the still sleepy faces of curious onlookers, and cast a horrifying glow upon a gruesome scene. The classic villa of the Zhang family, a symbol of wealth and tradition in the region, was completely engulfed in an inferno. Flames of orange and red licked up the floors of the house, devouring every wall, every window. The sound of cracking wood and shattering glass mixed with desperate screams and the thunderous spray from the firefighters' hoses, creating a chaotic and mournful symphony. Thick black smoke billowed upwards, obscuring the sky, carrying the acrid smell of burning belongings and something else, something that sent a shiver down the spine. Despite their best efforts and experience, it took the fire department several hours to tame the monstrous blaze. When the last flames finally flickered and died, leaving only plumes of grayish-white smoke rising from the rubble, the villa was nothing but a charred, skeletal frame. During the search for survivors, a heartbreaking discovery was made. In the master bedroom on the second floor, amidst the scorched and smoke-stained furniture, the body of 72-year-old Zhang Yui, the owner of the house, was found. She lay there, motionless, with clear signs of smoke inhalation and severe burns. At first glance, the scene showed no obvious signs of a break-in from the outside. The main door and the ground floor windows appeared to have been intact before the fire reached them. This, along with the victim's age, initially suggested a tragic accident, perhaps an electrical fault from an old appliance, or carelessness with a cooking fire or incense. As soon as news of the fire spread, Zhang Linfang, Madame Yui's direct grandson, arrived on the scene. The 23-year-old man appeared utterly devastated, in a state of profound shock. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes red and swollen. He seemed unable to stand on his own and had to be supported by others. Linfang's initial statements to the authorities were fragmented and stammering, mostly exclamations of shock and horror at the sudden loss. Not long after, Zhang Zhouyuan, Madame Yui's 25-year-old grandnephew, also rushed to the scene. Zhouyuan, in contrast to Linfang, tried to maintain his composure, though his face couldn't hide his grief and anxiety. He proactively spoke with the police, providing basic information about Madame Yui and the layout of the house. After the fire was completely extinguished and the scene was cordoned off for a professional investigation team, a surprising detail emerged that changed everything. A seasoned firefighter, meticulously checking the hidden corners of the large garden surrounding the villa, paused at a dense bush in a secluded corner of the backyard, a place rarely noticed or frequented. His sharp eyes spotted a strange object. It was a plastic can, the kind typically used for gasoline, partially melted and charred. The faint smell of gasoline still emanated from its opening, though mixed with the scent of smoke and ash. The can was well hidden, as if someone had deliberately placed it there to dispose of it. This discovery was immediately reported. It wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was a warning. Perhaps this was no accident. The appearance of the scorched plastic can with the smell of gasoline immediately ignited suspicion. What was thought to be a tragic fire quickly shifted to a criminal investigation. The police began their work with a new sense of urgency and seriousness. Investigators fanned out to collect statements from neighbors living around the Zhang villa. Many reported that in recent weeks, they had occasionally heard Madame Yui's raised voice arguing with someone inside the house. Her normally stern tone had become even sharper. A few observant neighbors had also noticed a look of distress and anxiety on the old woman's face whenever she went out. These accounts painted a picture of simmering tensions within the wealthy family. While investigators were trying to piece together these scattered bits of information, another bombshell was dropped, this time from the Zhang family's private lawyer. The lawyer, after being summoned by the police, provided a game-changing detail. Just 1 week before the tragedy, Madame Zhang Yui had officially changed her will. According to the new will, the majority of the family fortune, including a chain of traditional stores and valuable real estate, was to be transferred to Zhang Zhouyuan, the grandnephew whom she had always shown great affection and trust for. The most shocking part was that Zhang Linfang, the direct grandson who would normally be the main heir, was almost completely cut out. The will clearly stated the reason. Linfang lacked ambition, had fallen into bad habits, and was not capable of managing the family business. The rumored, poor academic performance was merely the tip of the iceberg of deeper issues Madame Yui saw in her grandson. Information about the new will was quickly shared within the family immediately after Madame Yui's death was confirmed, and Linfang was aware of it. His reaction to being disinherited was one of extreme resentment. His initial shock and grief turned into uncontrollable anger. In front of investigators and relatives, Linfang openly expressed his belief that his grandmother had treated him unfairly, that she had been manipulated and bewitched by Zhouyuan, a man Linfang had always secretly considered his rival. Harsh words and baseless accusations against Zhouyuan poured out endlessly. The conflict between the two cousins, which had long simmered under the weight of Madame Yui's comparisons and expectations, now exploded publicly, creating a tense and awkward scene for everyone present. Zhouyuan, though trying to remain calm, couldn't help but show his annoyance at Linfang's words. In the midst of the tense atmosphere, Mrs. Fu Yaqin, Madame Yui's longtime and trusted housekeeper, suddenly spoke up. Her voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears. She provided a crucial piece of information, another piece to the perplexing puzzle of the Zhang family. Mrs. Fu recounted that just a few days before the fire, Madame Yui had a blazing argument with Linfang. The cause of the fight was money and his unclear debts. The argument reached its peak when Madame Yui, in a fit of anger, threw Linfang out of the house and declared she would disown the grandson she believed was beyond reform. This testimony from Mrs. Fu was like another stab, deepening the growing suspicion and turning the investigation's focus squarely onto Zhang Linfang more strongly than ever before. With these new revelations, especially the information about the will and the fiery argument between Zhang Linfang and his grandmother, the police began to investigate Linfang more deeply. All of his social connections, daily habits, and especially his unusual spending patterns came under scrutiny. The review didn't take long to uncover a noteworthy detail. Linfang was a regular at a high-end nightclub, one of the most notorious party spots in downtown Foshan. More importantly, he was in a passionate relationship with Dong Manting, a young, beautiful, and well-known dancer at the club. Manting, 26, possessed a captivating and somewhat mysterious allure, attracting a great deal of attention. Investigators decided to approach Dong Manting. The meeting took place in her rather luxurious rented apartment. When she learned that Ah Feng's grandmother, as she called Madame Yui, had died in a fire and that Linfang was a suspect, Manting appeared extremely distressed. With tears welling in her eyes, she cried hysterically, expressing her shock and sorrow. Manting repeatedly described Linfang as a gentle, even naive and gullible person. She emphasized that Linfang adored her and was also terrified of his grandmother. Manting tried to provide an alibi for Linfang on the night of the fire, insisting that he was with her. However, when investigators pressed her for specific details about the timeline, her story began to show inconsistencies and unexplainable gaps, which only increased suspicion rather than dispelling it. While trying to clear her lover's name, Dong Manting let slip a critical piece of information. She mentioned that Linfang had been very stressed and anxious recently because he needed a large sum of money to handle an urgent matter. At the same time, Manting lamented that she herself was being aggressively pursued by some unsavory people for a debt, and she had hoped Linfang could help her resolve it. This account revealed a dual financial pressure weighing on both Linfang and herself. It showed that Linfang was in a desperate financial situation, needing money urgently, and Manting was no better, possibly even a financial burden to him. This further strengthened the potential motive for a reckless act. Just as investigators were considering the information from Manting, another unexpected tip came in. A colleague of Manting's at the nightclub, perhaps out of dislike for Manting or a desire to cooperate with the police, secretly provided a shocking piece of information. This colleague said that just a few days before the fire, Manting had happily bragged to a few close friends that her boyfriend was about to pull off a big job, and once it was successful, the two of them would run away together and live a life of luxury. This boast, if true, painted a completely different picture of Dong Manting's role in Zhang Linfeng's plan. It was no longer just about financial pressure, it was tinged with the color of a premeditated conspiracy. To better understand Zhang Linfeng, now the prime suspect, investigators began to dig into his past. Pieces of a complex psychological portrait gradually emerged from the accounts of acquaintances, relatives, and small details found among his personal belongings. Linfeng's childhood seemed to have been perpetually shadowed by comparison. He was constantly weighed against Zhang Zhouyuan, his smart, clever, and academically successful cousin who was always favored by their grandmother. The labels of being a poor student, lacking ambition, and sometimes even a black sheep were attached to Linfeng, intentionally or not, from a young age. These negative comments, repeated over many years, had burrowed deep into the boy's young mind, creating a severe inferiority complex. Linfeng grew up with a burning desire to prove himself, to be recognized, but ironically, he often chose the wrong, misguided paths to achieve this. The investigation into Linfeng's personal finances continued to reveal disturbing truths. Records from pawnshops and testimonies from certain individuals showed that Linfeng was involved in gambling and was in significant debt. In particular, he owed a large sum to Ji Xiaoshang, a young man of his age known to be a friend of Linfeng's but also involved in complex and illicit activities. When summoned by the police, Ji Xiaoshang was initially evasive, but faced with undeniable evidence, he finally confessed. Xiaoshang admitted that Linfeng owed him money and had recently promised that a large sum was coming his way to pay off the debt, with even some left over. More alarmingly, Xiaoshang stated that Linfeng had asked him how to make something disappear without a trace, a question full of dark and suspicious implications. With new evidence and testimony, Zhang Linfeng was brought in for re-interrogation. This time, there was no feigned shock or uncontrolled resentment. Linfeng began to show clear signs of panic. Faced with sharp questions and incriminating evidence, his statements became increasingly contradictory and illogical. Linfeng still clung to his old narrative, insisting that Zhang Zhouyuan was the mastermind behind everything. He tried to convince the investigators that Zhouyuan had framed him, creating disadvantageous situations to eliminate him from the inheritance list and thus legally seize their grandmother's assets. However, these words grew weaker and less convincing. While Linfeng's interrogation was underway, Mrs. Fu Yaqin, the housekeeper, after days of thought and internal struggle, remembered another important detail and decided to tell the police. Mrs. Fu recalled that a few days before the fire, on an afternoon when Madame Yui was out, she had accidentally seen Zhang Linfeng sneak into his grandmother's study. Notably, Linfeng was carrying a rather strange-looking cloth bag, not something he usually carried. A short while later, when Linfeng came out of the study, Mrs. Fu noticed the bag seemed fuller than when he went in, as if something had been stuffed inside. This detail, though small, opened up a new line of thinking about Linfeng's actions and intentions in the days leading up to the tragedy. Following the incriminating testimonies against Zhang Linfeng, Zhang Zhouyuan, the favored grandnephew and the main beneficiary of the new will, was also not exempt from thorough police investigation. Investigators needed to rule out every possibility, no matter how small. Zhouyuan was cooperative throughout the process. He frankly admitted that he knew Madame Yui had changed her will and named him the heir to the majority of the assets. However, Zhouyuan firmly insisted that he had done nothing to harm his grandmother, a person he had always respected. His alibi for the night of the crime was also solid, confirmed by multiple people. Nevertheless, investigators sensed that Zhouyuan seemed to be hiding something, perhaps related to the deep conflict between Linfeng and Madame Yui that he knew about but was reluctant to fully disclose. At the same time, Fu Yaqin, the loyal housekeeper, was also questioned more intensely. Mrs. Fu had lived with Madame Yui for many years, witnessing many of the ups and downs and secrets of the Zhang family. When asked about Linfeng, Mrs. Fu showed some fear but still maintained her absolute loyalty to her deceased employer. She vaguely recounted that Linfeng had, on more than one occasion, secretly stolen money from his grandmother to fund his nights out. The amounts were not large, but they demonstrated his bad habits and lack of respect for his grandmother. However, when pressed for more information about larger conflicts or more shocking secrets, Mrs. Fu became hesitant, as if there was something she couldn't bring herself to say. The complex relationship between Zhang Linfeng and Dong Manting continued to be investigated. Investigators discovered that Manting didn't just spend the money Linfeng gave her. Through text messages and testimonies from Manting's acquaintances, the police realized she frequently hinted, and even pressured, Linfang about needing their own house and car before they could consider a long-term future. These material demands, though not direct, created immense invisible pressure on Linfang, who already felt inferior and was desperate to prove himself, especially in the eyes of his lover. It seemed Manting had skillfully planted in Linfang's mind expectations of a luxurious life far beyond his current means. Meanwhile, a neighbor, who had previously reported hearing Madame Yue's raised voice, suddenly recalled another crucial detail. This person recounted that on the fateful night of the fire, a few hours before the flames erupted, they had caught a glimpse of a person with a build very similar to Zhang Linfang's leaving the grounds of Madame Yue's villa. Notably, this person was leaving in a great hurry, almost in a panic. And in their hand, they seemed to be carrying something dark, resembling a bag. This detail, combined with Fu Yaqin's testimony about Linfang carrying a strange cloth bag into his grandmother's room, further increased suspicion about Linfang's shadowy actions just before the tragedy. What was in that bag, and why was Linfang being so secretive? The forensic examination of Madame Zhang Yue's body was conducted with greater care and detail. Besides the initial findings of smoke inhalation and severe burns as the direct causes of death, forensic experts discovered another critical clue, a clue that could completely change the nature of the case. On Madame Yue's head, specifically on her temple, there was a purple bruise and swelling, accompanied by a small tear in the skin. A more detailed analysis showed this was the sign of a powerful impact, possibly from being pushed or struck. This injury, while it may not have been immediately fatal, could have easily stunned or even knocked Madame Yue unconscious. In that state, she would have been unable to recognize the danger or escape on her own when the fire broke out later. This new forensic discovery strongly reinforced the hypothesis that this was not a simple accident, but a murder followed by arson to destroy the evidence. The perpetrator may have attacked Madame Yue first, incapacitating her, before deliberately setting the fire to cover up the crime. With this theory, the pressure on Zhang Linfang, the main suspect, intensified dramatically. In subsequent interrogations, faced with more overwhelming evidence and questions, Linfang began to show clear signs of agitation. He could no longer maintain his feigned calm or initial panic, replaced now by irritability, restlessness, and aggressive reactions when investigators zeroed in on the weaknesses in his testimony. During an expanded search for evidence around the villa, the investigation team made another important discovery. Not far from Madame Yue's house, in a secluded public trash can, they found a pair of old athletic shoes, which appeared to have been deliberately discarded. Initial verification identified the shoes as belonging to Zhang Linfang. Significantly, upon close examination of the soles, experts found small soil particles. Analysis revealed that this soil perfectly matched the soil in the corner of Madame Yue's backyard, the exact spot where the scorched gasoline can had been found. Not only that, but a few dried blades of grass, a type that grew specifically in that thicket, were also stuck to the soles. These seemingly fragile traces directly linked Zhang Linfang to the scene where the most crucial piece of evidence in the arson was hidden. Just as the investigation was making significant headway and the net was closing in on Zhang Linfang, another unexpected piece of news arrived. Dong Manting, Linfang's lover, who had given inconsistent and suspicious testimony, had suddenly disappeared from her rented apartment. She left in a hurry, taking only a few personal belongings and some cash. This disappearance was nothing short of an indirect confession of her involvement in the case, or at least that she was hiding something incredibly important. Was Manting running away out of fear, or to escape the punishment of the law? Dong Manting's sudden disappearance made the investigation more urgent than ever. Believing that Manting could be an accomplice or hold key information, the police immediately issued a nationwide alert for her. Her photo and personal information were sent to all local police units, bus stations, train stations, and border crossings. The investigators believed that if Manting was deeply involved, she couldn't stay hidden for long. While tracking down Dong Manting, the police also dug deeper into her past and her connections. What they discovered only heightened their suspicions. Manting was not just a simple dancer. She had been involved in several small-scale romance scams, targeting naive, wealthy men. The victims were typically seduced by Manting, who would then extract money from them through various means before disappearing. More seriously, the police found that Manting currently owed a large sum of money to a notorious figure in Foshan's criminal underworld. This debt could have been one of the reasons she pushed Linfang to get money at any cost, and it could also be why she decided to flee when she felt the situation was becoming dangerous. Meanwhile, in the detention center, when Zhang Linfang heard that Dong Manting had fled, his reaction was complex. First, a hint of surprise, then a clear collapse. But mixed in, investigators also noticed a flicker of anger, a sense of resentment. Linfang muttered to himself, the words unclear but the phrase, "even she abandoned me," could be heard. This reaction showed an emotional attachment, perhaps one-sided or based on illusions, that Linfang had for Manting. It also revealed the possibility that Linfang felt betrayed, left alone to face the consequences. The hunt for Dong Manting didn't last long. With an extensive information network and tight coordination, after just a few days, Manting was located and arrested at a bus station in a small city near the southwestern border. She was preparing to board a long-distance bus, planning to travel to a remote province, likely to try to cross the border or go into hiding. When arrested, Manting appeared terrified and desperate. Searching her luggage, police found a significant amount of cash and some small pieces of jewelry. This money could have been given to her by Linfang after he took it from his grandmother's house, or it could have been her own savings. Regardless of its origin, carrying a large amount of cash and jewelry while on the run further solidified suspicions about her role in the case. Manting's capture promised to bring forth crucial testimony, shedding more light on the dark corners of the case. Arrested and brought back to Foshan, Dong Manting was quickly taken into the interrogation room. Facing experienced investigators, Manting initially remained evasive. She sobbed hysterically, trying to portray herself as a pitiful victim. Manting tried every way to pin all the blame on Zhang Linfang. She claimed that she was forced, even threatened, by Linfang to keep silent about his actions. In her initial testimony, Manting tried to paint a completely different picture of Linfang, a reckless man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, and she was just a weak lover who was unwillingly dragged into a spiral of crime. However, Dong Manting's stubbornness didn't last long. The investigators were prepared with irrefutable evidence. They presented the photo of Manting being arrested at the bus station as she was about to flee, text messages urging Linfang to get money quickly because she couldn't wait any longer, and the testimony from her colleague at the nightclub about her bragging about an upcoming big score. Faced with this evidence, Manting began to waver. The tears still flowed, but the confidence in her voice disappeared. She realized she could hardly deny her involvement completely, and continuing to lie would only make things worse. Facing the prospect of a heavy sentence, Dong Manting finally decided to cooperate with the investigation, with the faint hope of receiving leniency. At this point, Manting began to confess the truths she had tried to hide. She admitted that she knew Zhang Linfang intended to do something to his grandmother, perhaps to intimidate her, force her to change the will, or give him a large sum of money. Manting testified that Linfang frequently complained about being looked down upon and treated unfairly by his grandmother, and he was obsessed with the idea of having a lot of money so the two of them could start a new, wealthy, carefree life. However, Manting still insisted that she had no idea Linfang would be ruthless enough to commit murder and arson. She claimed she only thought Linfang would cause some trouble, create some pressure, and never imagined things would go so far. As the interrogation continued, Dong Manting, perhaps to prove her sincerity, revealed a crucial detail she had previously omitted. She recalled that during their intimate conversations, Zhang Linfang had told her that his grandmother, Zhang Yui, kept more than just money and jewelry in the safe in her study, as was rumored. According to Linfang, the safe contained something that could ruin his life, a dark secret he didn't want anyone to know. Linfang had told Manting that he had to get that thing back at all costs, before it was too late. This detail immediately caught the investigators' attention. It opened up a new possibility for Linfang's motive, not just money, but also the concealment of some terrible secret. The safe in Madame Yue's study suddenly became the center of attention. Dong Manting's testimony about something that could ruin Zhang Linfang's life, hidden in Madame Yue's safe, immediately focused the investigation team's attention on the victim's charred study. Although the fire had heavily damaged most of the house, the sturdy metal safe, located in a corner of the study, had maintained its basic structure. Its exterior was blackened with soot, slightly warped in places by the high heat, but the thick steel door remained tightly shut, as if trying to protect the secrets within. Locksmith experts were called to the scene. After a period of careful work, the heavy door of the safe was finally opened. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and residual heat. Contrary to rumors of a huge treasure, the amount of cash and jewelry found inside was not as large as imagined. There was only a small amount of cash, likely for Madame Yue's daily expenses, and a few old gold jewelry pieces, more sentimental than valuable. However, what truly captured the investigators' attention was a file folder placed neatly beneath the cash and jewelry. This was what Linfeng had feared. The folder contained an old psychiatric medical record for Zhang Linfeng, detailing his treatment since adolescence. The records showed Linfeng had exhibited signs of behavioral disorders, was easily agitated, and had oppositional tendencies. Alongside it was a stack of gambling debt notes, clearly signed by Linfeng, with the total amount being substantial. And most notably, tucked between these papers, was an unfinished letter from Madame Zhang Yue. The handwriting was shaky with age but still clear, expressing immense disappointment and heartbreak over her grandson's mistakes and his downward spiral. However, amidst the lines of reprimand, the letter also revealed a faint glimmer of hope, a wish that Linfeng would realize his mistakes and change before it was too late. What was found in the safe revealed a much more painful and complex truth. Madame Zhang Yue's decision to disinherit Linfeng was not merely because he had fallen into gambling and a dissolute lifestyle. More importantly, she feared that Linfeng's unstable psychological issues, if left unchecked, would destroy the entire business that she and her husband had built over a lifetime. She kept these medical and debt records not to threaten or humiliate Linfeng. Perhaps it was a grandmother's last, desperate effort to pull the grandson she loved back onto the right path. Or, in the worst-case scenario, it would be the evidence she needed to intervene more forcefully, to protect the family assets from the risk of being destroyed by Linfeng. She never imagined that these very efforts would become one of the triggers that pushed the tragedy to its peak. Meanwhile, Ji Xiaosheng, Linfeng's gambling buddy, after days of detention and continuous psychological interrogation, finally broke. Faced with evidence of his contact with Linfeng just before and after the crime, along with Dong Manting's testimony, Xiaosheng confessed his entire role. He admitted not only to providing the gasoline can to Linfeng upon request but also that Linfeng had promised him a share of the loot if the plan succeeded. More importantly, Xiaosheng admitted that Linfeng had asked him how to open an old type of safe, similar to the one Madame Yue used. This testimony from Ji Xiaosheng provided another crucial piece of the puzzle, showing that Linfeng had prepared in advance for the break-in and for opening the safe. The truth gradually came to light through Zhang Linfeng's later confession, combined with the collected evidence, allowing us to reconstruct part of what happened on that fateful night. That night, after being thrown out of the house by his grandmother, Madame Zhang Yue, during a fiery argument about money and debt, Linfeng wandered the streets of Foshan in a state of turmoil. Feelings of resentment, being looked down upon, and humiliation surged within him. At the same time, urgent messages from Dong Manting kept appearing on his cheap phone screen. Manting constantly complained about her debts, the threats from gangster creditors, and the prospect of a better life if Linfeng could get his hands on a large sum of money. The pressure from his lover, combined with his own despair and resentment towards his grandmother, pushed Linfeng to the edge. In his mind, there was only one thought: he had to get money, and he had to retrieve what was in that safe, the things he believed could destroy his future. With that resolve, Linfeng went to Ji Xiaosheng. He borrowed a little more money, and more importantly, got a small can of gasoline that Xiaosheng used for his old motorcycle. Linfeng was vague about his purpose, only hinting that he needed to take care of some old things. In addition, Linfeng prepared a cloth bag containing a few simple prying tools like a small crowbar, pliers, and some steel wire, things he thought could help him open his grandmother's old safe. Linfeng's initial plan was likely just to break in, steal money and the important papers. The gasoline was brought along as a backup plan. If he was discovered, or couldn't open the safe, he would start a small fire to create a distraction, cause chaos, and create an opportunity to escape, or perhaps to apply pressure and destroy part of the property to intimidate his grandmother. Waiting until late at night when the streets were quiet, Linfeng returned to the family villa. Using his familiarity with the house's layout and a weak point in the security system, he easily slipped inside through a side window in the kitchen, which was rarely locked securely. Tiptoeing, Linfeng went straight to Madame Yue's study on the second floor. His heart pounded as he fumbled with the safe. But just then, a small noise came from the doorway. Madame Yui, perhaps a light sleeper due to her age, or because of a grandmother's intuition, had unexpectedly woken up. She stepped out, and grandmother and grandson faced each other in the dim light of a night lamp. Madame Yui did not scream, not in the way Linfeng had imagined. Instead, she looked straight into her grandson's eyes, her gaze filled with utter disappointment, pain, and a hint of contempt. Her voice, though not loud, cut through Linfeng like a knife with every word, speaking of his ingratitude, his relentless downward spiral, and how he had destroyed all of the family's hopes. Linfeng, caught in the act, both ashamed and angry, tried to push her aside to continue with the safe. Madame Yui, despite her age and frailty, tried to stop her grandson. A small struggle, a scuffle, ensued. In a burst of anger and panic from being discovered, Linfeng used all his strength to push his grandmother hard. Madame Yui stumbled, falling backward. Her head struck the hard edge of the solid rosewood desk. A dry thud echoed. The old woman collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Linfeng froze. He trembled as he approached, shaking her body. Madame Yui didn't respond. Linfeng tried to check for breath, but in his extreme panic, he couldn't feel anything clearly, only that she was lying motionless. A horrific thought flashed through Linfeng's mind. Things have gone too far. There's no turning back. Overwhelming fear began to consume his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Zhang Linfeng stood frozen beside his grandmother's motionless body. The study was terrifyingly silent, filled only with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. Panic and extreme fear gripped Linfeng's mind. The thought that he might have caused the death of his own grandmother, the woman who raised him, made him fall apart. But immediately after, another instinct, the instinct for survival and to evade responsibility, rose powerfully. Linfeng realized that if this was discovered, his life would be over. There was only one way, a cruel and reckless way, to erase all traces, to turn this into nothing more than an accident: fire. With that decision made, Linfeng began to act mechanically, like a cornered animal. His mind no longer had room for remorse or family ties, only the cold calculation of how to escape punishment. He managed to drag Madame Yui's body, which at that moment might still have had a faint flicker of life, though Linfeng didn't dare, or didn't want, to check closely, from the study into her bedroom. He placed her on the bed, trying to stage the scene to look like she was sleeping soundly. Then, Linfeng began to mess up the belongings in both rooms to make everything look more chaotic. He took the gasoline can he had prepared and, trembling, poured gasoline in various spots. Linfeng concentrated most of the gasoline in the study, where the safe and most of his traces were, and in Madame Yui's bedroom, where her body lay. The strong smell of gasoline quickly filled the air, signaling the impending tragedy. Once everything was set, Zhang Linfeng lit the fire. A match was struck, and the small flame quickly caught onto the gasoline-soaked areas. In an instant, the fire erupted violently, spreading rapidly from room to room. The initial crackling of the flames quickly turned into a series of pops and the sound of splintering wood. The immense heat and black smoke began to envelop everything. Linfeng didn't dare to stay long. He hastily escaped through the back door, a route he had planned in advance. Running out into the garden, Linfeng quickly threw the empty gasoline can into a dense bush, hoping it would not be found. The cloth bag with the prying tools was thrown down a nearby sewer drain. After disposing of all the evidence, Linfeng did not immediately return to the scene. He ran straight to Dong Manting, trying to create a false alibi that he had been with his lover all night. Only after setting everything up did Linfeng return to the villa, now engulfed in a sea of fire, with a look of horror and shock, like a grandson grieving the sudden death of his grandmother. However, no matter how sophisticated the cover-up, a crime can hardly escape justice. During a more thorough examination of the scene after the fire was extinguished, forensic experts discovered a seemingly tiny detail of immense significance. When examining Madame Zhang Yui's fingernails, alongside tiny skin fragments, possibly from Linfeng during the struggle, they also found several ultra-fine metal fibers, as thin as hair. The origin of these metal fibers was initially a mystery. They did not match any common fabric or household item. This fragile detail cast a new shadow of doubt over the case. The ultra-fine metal fibers found under Madame Zhang Yui's fingernails became a puzzling detail for the investigation team. They were too fine, too different from the materials typically found in a home. Experts ruled out the possibility that they came from clothing, bedding, or any decorative items in the victim's bedroom or study. Their presence indicated close contact, a scratching or struggling with some metal-containing object just before or during the crime. This further reinforced the theory that Madame Yui had put up a fight before being attacked. At this point, investigators decided to extract more information from Dong Manting, Zhang Linfeng's lover. Although Manting had already revealed many details, she might still know about Linfeng's habits or items he typically carried. When questioned more closely about Linfeng's personal belongings, especially things he might have carried on the night of the crime, Dong Manting, after some thought, suddenly remembered a detail. She said that Linfeng had an old, dark-colored cloth bag that he occasionally used to carry small items. Inside that bag, among other miscellaneous things, Manting vaguely remembered Linfeng keeping a small pair of pliers, a few screws, and some old bicycle repair tools he used back in his school days. This testimony, while not directly related to the metal fibers, mentioned the cloth bag, a piece of evidence that both Mrs. Fu Yaqin and the neighbor had referred to. With information about the cloth bag and Linfeng's previous statement about disposing of his tools, the investigation team decided to conduct a large-scale search of the sewer drains near Madame Yui's house. They checked every manhole within a radius of several hundred meters. And their persistence paid off. After many hours of difficult searching, the team recovered a dark-colored cloth bag from a sewer drain not far from the scene. The bag was soaked and covered in mud, but still largely intact. Inside the bag, just as Linfeng had described when talking about getting rid of the tools, police found a small crowbar, pliers, some steel wire, and other crude prying tools. However, the most surprising and important discovery was another object mixed in with them, a metal scouring pad, the kind used to scrub stubborn rust off pots and pans. This pad was old and worn, with many small metal fibers coming loose. Immediately, forensic experts conducted a comparison. The result was as expected. The ultra-fine metal fibers found under Madame Yui's fingernails were a perfect match in structure and chemical composition to the fibers from this metal scouring pad. There was no longer any doubt. During the time Linfeng was rummaging, trying to open the safe, or attacking her, Madame Yui had tried to scratch and cling to the cloth bag Linfeng was carrying, and her fingernails had scraped against the metal scouring pad, leaving behind irrefutable evidence. The evidence of the cloth bag, the prying tools inside, and especially the matching metal fibers became a fatal blow to Zhang Linfeng. When confronted with this evidence in the interrogation room, Linfeng could no longer deny it or blame anyone else. His face turned from pale to ashen. His eyes widened, staring blankly at the metal fibers placed before him. Linfeng began to show clear signs of a psychological breakdown. He trembled and stammered, still trying to utter weak denials, claiming it wasn't his, that he knew nothing. However, his confidence was completely gone, replaced only by fear and despair. With the irrefutable physical evidence, especially the metal fibers from the scouring pad, investigators decided to increase the psychological pressure on Zhang Linfeng. They shifted their tactics from rapid-fire questioning to a methodical analysis, pointing out every contradiction in Linfeng's statements and cross-referencing them with the collected evidence. The images of the gasoline can, the shoe prints in the garden, the cloth bag with its prying tools and scouring pad, along with the testimonies of Dong Manting, Ji Xiaoshang, and other witnesses, were all pieced together into an increasingly complete picture of Linfeng's crime. Each piece of evidence presented was like a hammer blow, slowly shattering his shell of denial. During the days of continuous detention and interrogation, Zhang Linfeng's psyche began to show serious cracks. The image of his grandmother lying motionless, her final words of disappointment, the moment the fire erupted, all of it haunted him day and night. He suffered from chronic insomnia, frequently had nightmares, and screamed in his sleep. Furthermore, the news of Dong Manting's betrayal, the person Linfeng once trusted and cherished, dealt a heavy blow to his already fragile mental state. Linfeng felt abandoned, turned against by the whole world. The prospect of facing severe legal punishment, possibly years in prison or even the highest sentence, sent Linfeng into a state of panic and despair. He began to refuse food, his body weakened rapidly, and his mental state grew increasingly unstable. To add more pressure, investigators cleverly let Linfeng know that Dong Manting had confessed almost everything about their relationship, the financial pressures, and Linfeng's shadowy plans. This information, coupled with the possibility that Manting would soon be brought in for a direct confrontation, became the last straw. For Linfeng, Manting was not just a lover, but also a part of his motivation, a reason for his wrongdoings. The fact that Manting had betrayed him and was ready to confess everything to save herself completely shattered Linfeng's last shred of hope of hiding his guilt or finding sympathy from others. Loneliness and a sense of betrayal enveloped him. One afternoon, after days of silence and collapse, Zhang Linfeng suddenly made a strange request. He asked the guard for a piece of paper and a pen. No one knew what Linfeng intended to write, a final confession, a letter to his family, or one last attempt to justify himself. This small request, however, indicated a shift was occurring in the killer's mind. Was this a sign of a complete breakdown, or a turning point in the investigation? Contrary to what many expected, the letter Zhang Linfeng wrote was not a sincere apology to his family or a suicide note. It was a confession, but one filled with rambling, contradictory statements. In the letter, Linfeng admitted to parts of his actions but simultaneously tried to blame his circumstances and the pressures he endured. He blamed Dong Manting for her constant material demands, pushing him into a corner. He also didn't forget to mention his grandmother's excessive strictness, claiming it made him feel oppressed, looked down upon, and led to his rebellious intentions. The messy, error-filled handwriting revealed an unstable state of mind, more self-pity than genuine remorse. There were moments where Linfeng appeared repentant, but they were immediately followed by justifications, showing he still hadn't fully accepted responsibility for his monstrous crime. Meanwhile, Dong Manting's detailed testimony was increasingly corroborated by objective evidence. Investigators had collected text message histories and call logs between Manting and Linfeng, clearly showing Manting's constant pressure on Linfeng for money and her painting of lavish futures. Testimonies from Manting's creditors also confirmed she was being aggressively pursued for debts, which further motivated her to pressure Linfeng in turn. Although Manting did not directly incite Linfeng to murder or arson, her actions and words clearly acted as a catalyst, pushing Linfeng, someone already with psychological issues and an inferiority complex, down the path of crime. The pressure from all sides was mounting on Zhang Linfeng. The physical evidence was undeniable. The gasoline can with his fingerprints, the shoe prints at the scene where the can was hidden, the metal fibers from the scouring pad matching those on the victim's fingernails, the cloth bag with prying tools. Alongside this was the testimony from witnesses, from the neighbor who saw Linfeng leaving suspiciously, to Mrs. Fu Yaqin who saw him sneak into his grandmother's study. And most importantly, the detailed, albeit self-serving, testimonies of Dong Manting and Ji Xiaoshang. All these pieces had been woven together, creating a complete and clear picture of the crime, leaving no room for denial or doubt. Facing this impenetrable wall of evidence, and perhaps due to his psychological collapse after days of detention and interrogation, Zhang Linfeng finally broke. During a session with an investigator, after a long silence, Linfeng looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his voice hoarse. He looked straight at the investigator and uttered an unexpected question, a question containing a faint glimmer of hope, or perhaps just one last probe. If I tell you the whole truth, can I get leniency? This question, though not a direct confession, implicitly admitted that Linfeng was hiding more, and that he was ready to face the truth. Zhang Linfeng's probing question signaled that his final defensive wall had crumbled. After the investigator explained the law's policy of leniency for those who confess sincerely and show remorse, Linfeng finally decided to admit to his entire crime. His voice, initially trembling and broken, gradually became steady and coherent as he recounted the entire plan and the events of that horrifying night in detail. Linfeng admitted that his initial plan was only to break into his grandmother's house to steal money and the documents in the safe, the medical records and debt notes, which he believed his grandmother used to control and humiliate him. He had prepared meticulously, from observing her daily routine and learning how to open the old safe, to preparing prying tools and even a can of gasoline as a contingency. On the night of the crime, after sneaking into the study, he was discovered by his grandmother. During the struggle, as Madame Yui tried to stop him and scolded him, Linfeng, in a fit of anger and panic, pushed her hard, causing her to fall and hit her head on the edge of the desk. Linfeng described this moment with horror still visible on his face. Seeing his grandmother motionless, Linfeng panicked. He checked her and thought she was dead, or at least not moving. The fear of being discovered, arrested, and facing a murder charge overwhelmed all other thoughts. And in that moment of desperation, Linfeng made a cruel decision. to set a fire to destroy all traces and create the scene of an accident. He coldly recounted how he dragged Madame Yui, who he said still showed faint signs of life but he wasn't sure and didn't want to check closely, into the bedroom. Then, he poured gasoline and lit the fire, trying to destroy any evidence that could be used against him. Zhang Linfeng's true motive was now laid bare, raw and explicit. It wasn't just greed for money, but the culmination of a long process of suppression. The inferiority complex from being labeled a poor student, the feeling of being looked down upon and compared to Zhang Zhouyuan, had created a deep emotional wound. The financial pressure from Dong Manting's demands and his mounting gambling debts had pushed him to the brink. The fear of the secrets in the safe being exposed, especially the psychiatric records, which Linfeng believed would completely destroy his image and future, was also a significant factor. And finally, it was the loss of control in a moment of extreme anger and desperation when confronted by his grandmother. In his confession, Linfeng revealed another chilling detail. He admitted that in his panic after his grandmother fell, he had a fleeting thought of using a small knife he always carried to end things if she woke up and screamed. But in the end, he didn't dare to do it, partly out of fear, partly because he didn't want to have blood directly on his hands. This knife was later found by guards, hidden by Linfeng in a discreet spot in his cell. Ending his hours-long confession, Zhang Linfeng collapsed onto the table, burying his face in his hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The belated tears streamed down his gaunt face. Through his sobs, Linfeng choked out that he never really wanted his grandmother to die, that he just wanted to take back what belonged to him, to live his own life. He repeated over and over, everything got out of my control. I didn't mean to, but could these tears and excuses soothe the pain he had caused, or change the truth of a horrific crime? After Zhang Linfeng fully confessed, investigators conducted a direct confrontation between him and Dong Manting. The purpose was to further clarify each person's role, especially the extent of Manting's influence and complicity, if any, in the entire case. During the confrontation, Dong Manting, despite having confessed much already, still tried to minimize her role as much as possible. When facing Linfeng, she continued to cry, appearing weak and pitiful. Manting insisted that she only complained to Linfeng about her personal financial difficulties and the pressure of her debts. She claimed she never incited Linfeng to do anything illegal, let alone thought he would kill someone. Manting tried to paint herself as a naive girlfriend, deceived and emotionally exploited by Linfeng. However, when investigators presented specific evidence from text messages and call logs between the two, the truth about Dong Manting's role gradually became clear. It was true that Manting did not directly order or incite Linfeng to kill his grandmother. But what she did was a far more subtle and dangerous form of psychological manipulation. In her messages, Manting constantly planted negative thoughts about the grandmother in Linfeng's head, calling her stingy, old-fashioned, and an obstacle to their happiness. She relentlessly painted beautiful pictures of a luxurious life if Linfeng could get a large sum of money from his grandmother's estate. Manting frequently compared Linfeng to other men, implicitly criticizing his poverty and lack of ability, while constantly pressuring him to do something to prove his manhood. Manting's manipulation targeted Linfeng's psychological weaknesses precisely: his inferiority complex, his insecurities, and his desperate need for recognition and validation. Furthermore, the evidence showed that Dong Manting knew in advance that Zhang Linfeng intended to break into his grandmother's house to steal money and property. In some messages, Linfeng had hinted at his plan, and Manting, far from stopping him, had made veiled suggestions about being careful and covering his tracks well. This showed that Manting had, at the very least, condoned Linfeng's criminal behavior, even if she didn't foresee its catastrophic consequences. Another crucial detail was clarified. After Linfeng managed to get some cash from his grandmother's study, he gave a portion to Manting. The fact that Manting accepted and spent this money, knowing full well its illicit origin, further solidified her role as an accomplice. To shed more light on Dong Manting's character and methods, investigators found and spoke with an old acquaintance of hers. This man, a former victim of a romance scam perpetrated by Manting years ago, agreed to testify. He provided concrete evidence, including letters and messages, of the money-grubbing and psychological manipulation tactics Manting had used on him. This testimony painted a completely different picture of Dong Manting, not a naive, weak girl, but someone experienced in exploiting others' feelings for personal gain. With Linfeng, Manting had likely seen a potential gold mine, a naive fool who was easy to control, and she had not hesitated to use every trick in the book to achieve her goals. With Zhang Linfang's detailed confession and the evidence clarifying the roles of Dong Manting and Ji Xiaoshang, the case file on the murder of Madame Zhang Yui and the subsequent arson was nearing completion. All witness testimonies, from the neighbor, the housekeeper Fu Yaqin, to the family lawyer, friends, and creditors of the involved parties, were carefully pieced together. The initially scattered pieces now fit together, creating a comprehensive, detailed, and clear picture of the events, motives, and consequences of one of the most shocking family tragedies in Foshan at that time. The investigative authorities conducted a crime scene reenactment based on Zhang Linfang's confession. This process helped clarify specific details about how Linfang broke into the villa, his movements inside, the process of ransacking the study, the scuffle with Madame Yui, and finally, the calculated act of arson to cover up his crime. Every action, every detail was reenacted by Linfang under the strict supervision of law enforcement, further confirming the authenticity of his confession. The cloth bag with the metal scouring pad, the gasoline can, the soil-stained shoes, all matched his testimony and the actual events. The closing of the case left a heavy and lasting impact on the remaining family members and those involved. Zhang Zhouyuan, the grandnephew trusted and endowed with the family assets by Madame Yui, lived through days of torment and self-reproach. He couldn't stop wondering if the favor his grandmother showed him had been an indirect cause pushing Linfang down his criminal path. Though not directly at fault, this psychological burden would likely follow Zhouyuan for the rest of his life. Mrs. Fu Yaqin, the loyal housekeeper, was also plunged into grief and regret. She regretted not noticing Linfang's unusual signs earlier, not intervening more forcefully in the family conflicts. For Linfang's parents, it was a shock beyond words. The pain of losing the family's matriarch, combined with the horrifying truth that their own son was the killer, left them completely broken. The once prestigious Zhang family was now shattered by a tragedy caused by one of their own. While clearing out Madame Zhang Yui's remaining personal belongings from the ashes, a worn, smoke-stained old notebook was found. Inside, tucked between pages of miscellaneous notes, was a yellowed photograph. It was a picture of Zhang Linfang as a chubby little boy, around 5 or 6 years old, smiling brightly, his eyes clear and innocent. Beside the photo, a few lines were written in neat blue ink, in Madame Yui's handwriting. "I hope my Feng grows up to be a good man, a man useful to the world." These simple words, filled with a grandmother's love and hope, were now incredibly poignant and bitter to read. They served as a cruel reminder of the contrast between the past and the present, between love and crime. After the investigation concluded and the case file was completed with full evidence and testimonies, Zhang Linfang and Dong Manting were formally indicted by the Foshan Municipal People's Procuratorate on serious charges. Ji Xiaoshang was also prosecuted for his role as an accomplice in concealing and failing to report a crime. The trial attracted immense public interest, not just in Foshan but across the region. On the day of the trial, the atmosphere both inside and outside the courtroom was extremely heavy. Zhang Linfang's parents, if present, likely couldn't contain their pain and shame. They sat in the gallery for the accused's family, their faces blank, their eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. Their collapse was evident in every gesture, every look. For them, this was not just the loss of a relative, but the fall of the family's honor, a stain that would be difficult to wash away. Standing in the dock, Zhang Linfang and Dong Manting were a study in contrasts. Linfang, thin and gaunt after months in detention, appeared resigned. He kept his head down for most of the time, only occasionally looking up at the judicial panel with lifeless eyes. It seemed Linfang had accepted his fate, with no intention of denying or justifying his actions anymore. In contrast, Dong Manting still tried to appear weak and fragile. She sobbed, whimpered, and repeatedly looked towards her defense lawyer and the judges with pleading eyes. Manting still tried every way to blame Linfang, her circumstances, and the pressures she endured, in an attempt to lessen her criminal responsibility. Ji Xiaoshang appeared rather defiant, but he couldn't hide his anxiety as the prosecutor read the indictment. The case immediately sent shockwaves through society. The media continuously reported on the trial's proceedings. The public expressed extreme outrage at Zhang Linfang's cruel and inhumane actions. Killing his own grandmother, the person who raised and cared for him, then setting a fire to cover it up, was an unforgivable crime. Dong Manting's role was also heavily condemned. Although she did not directly commit the crime, her materialism, her gold-digging habits, and her psychological manipulation were considered significant factors that pushed Linfeng down the path of crime. The case also sparked deep discussions and analyses on family tragedies in modern society, the moral decay of some youth, and the terrible pressure of money and a materialistic lifestyle that can corrupt a person. Many also raised questions about the responsibility of families and society in educating and guiding the younger generation. Before the court was to officially announce the verdict, an unexpected development occurred. Zhang Linfeng, through his lawyer, requested a final meeting with Zhang Zhouyuan. This was a rather strange request, as throughout the investigation and trial, Linfeng had always shown hatred and jealousy towards his cousin. What did Linfeng want to say to Zhouyuan before facing the final judgment of his life? Zhang Linfeng's request to see Zhang Zhouyuan was granted. The meeting took place in a small room at the detention center, under the strict supervision of a guard. The two cousins, once silent rivals in Linfeng's eyes, now faced each other in the most ironic of circumstances. Zhouyuan arrived with a heavy heart. He didn't know what Linfeng wanted to say, nor how he should react. Contrary to what Zhouyuan might have imagined, Linfeng was not aggressive or blaming as before. He sat opposite Zhouyuan, his head bowed, his hands clasped on the table. After a long silence, Linfeng looked up, meeting Zhouyuan's gaze. In a hoarse, weak voice, Linfeng expressed only one thing, not an apology, not a justification. "I'm sorry for destroying everything." Just one short sentence, but it contained so much. Perhaps it was a belated admission of his mistakes, of his blind jealousy, of the irreparable damage he had caused to the family, to Zhouyuan, and to himself. Zhang Zhouyuan was silent. He didn't know what to say. His expression as he looked at Linfeng was incredibly complex, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and something incomprehensible. The meeting ended quickly, with no more words exchanged. Meanwhile, the defense lawyers for Zhang Linfeng and Dong Manting were hastily preparing their final arguments for the sentencing hearing. For Linfeng, although the crime was clear and hard to defend, his lawyer tried to focus on factors that could be considered for mitigation. These included his young age, limited legal awareness, the psychological instability he had suffered since his youth, the pressure from debts, and the incitement and manipulation from Dong Manting. The lawyer hoped these factors might help Linfeng avoid the maximum penalty. As for Dong Manting, her lawyer focused on emphasizing that she was not the mastermind and did not directly participate in the murder or arson. Her role was passive, she was emotionally exploited by Linfeng, and her actions were limited to knowing but not reporting the crime, or consuming assets obtained through another's crime. The night before the verdict, Zhang Linfeng sat alone in his cell. Memories of his grandmother flooded back. He remembered her strict teachings, her sometimes harsh rebukes. But interspersed with these were rare moments when she showed her love in her own way. A delicious dish she cooked for him when he was a child, a worried look when he was sick, a clumsy word of encouragement when he achieved something small. The cruel contrast between these fragile, warm memories and the harsh, criminal reality he had created tormented him. He realized that no matter how strict she was, it was still love, a grandmother's concern for her grandson. But it was all too late. That evening, Zhang Linfeng refused his last meal before the fateful day. He sat motionless on the hard bed, staring blankly into space. Perhaps, in these final moments, Linfeng was trying to confront what he had done, and the sentence he was about to receive. The sentencing hearing took place on a tense morning. The courtroom was packed with people, from legal officials and journalists to the victims' and defendants' families, and a large crowd of interested citizens. The prosecutor, representing the state, delivered a sharp and powerful closing argument against the defendants. For Zhang Linfeng, the prosecution asserted that his actions were exceptionally grave, not only violating human life but also destroying valuable property. Although Linfeng may not have intended to kill from the outset, his criminal intent transformed during the course of the burglary when he was discovered. The act of pushing Madame Yui, leading to a fatal head injury, then dragging her into the bedroom and setting fire to the house while she may have still been alive, constituted the crime of murder, with aggravating circumstances, including killing a relative for whom he had a duty of care, and committing the crime in a savage and brutal manner. The subsequent act of arson constituted the crime of intentional destruction of property. The prosecution emphasized that Linfeng's methods were incredibly cruel and inhumane, causing extreme public outrage, and that he needed to be permanently removed from society. Regarding Dong Manting, the prosecution pointed out that, while not directly committing the crime, Manting had engaged in fraud by abuse of confidence, by continuously pressuring and suggesting that Linfeng find ways to get money from his family to support her, knowing full well he had no financial means. After Linfeng committed the crime and obtained the money, Manting accepted and used a portion of it. Additionally, Manting was guilty of concealing a crime by knowing Linfeng had committed a serious offense but failing to report it, and even attempting to flee. The prosecution recommended a prison sentence commensurate with her role and actions. For Ji Xiaosheng, the prosecution accused him of concealing a crime and failure to report a crime, for providing Linfeng with the tools to commit the crime and for not reporting to the authorities after knowing Linfeng had committed the act. In rebuttal, the defense lawyers presented arguments to mitigate their client's criminal responsibility. Zhang Linfeng's lawyer highlighted factors such as his youth, limited legal awareness, a childhood lacking emotional support and proper guidance, and living with an inferiority complex due to comparisons. The lawyer particularly pointed to Linfeng's pre-existing psychological issues, with medical records to prove it, and argued that at the time of the crime, the defendant was strongly provoked by the victim's words, compounded by the pressure of debt and manipulation from Dong Manting. The lawyer argued that Linfeng's initial act was not murder but theft, and events spiraled out of control. Dong Manting's lawyer focused on the argument that she had no criminal intent, was not the mastermind, and did not directly participate in the murder or arson. All of Manting's actions stemmed from ignorance, personal financial difficulties, and being emotionally exploited by Linfeng. The lawyer argued that Manting was a victim of circumstance and of Linfeng himself. After the debate between the prosecution and defense, the defendants were given their final words. Zhang Linfeng, in a trembling voice, simply bowed his head and mumbled an apology to his family and his grandmother, asking the court for leniency. Dong Manting continued to cry hysterically, pleading her difficult circumstances, her elderly parents who needed care, and begging the court for a chance to start over. Ji Xiaosheng also expressed remorse and asked for a reduced sentence. The atmosphere in the courtroom became incredibly heavy and tense. Everyone fell silent, waiting. After the defendants spoke their last words, the Judicial Council announced they would retire to deliberate. The wait stretched on in silence, each passing moment thick with pressure for everyone present. Before the Judicial Council delivers its final verdict, let's take a moment to look back and analyze more deeply the criminal psychology of Zhang Linfeng, as well as the roles of those involved, to better understand the root of this tragedy. Zhang Linfeng's crime was not a simple impulsive act but the result of a long chain of suppressed emotions and a distorted personality. From a young age, Linfeng lived under the enormous shadow of his cousin, Zhang Zhouyuan. The label of being stupid and incompetent, carelessly or intentionally applied by adults, created a deep-seated inferiority complex. This complex, instead of becoming a motivation to strive, transformed into resentment and silent envy. Linfeng craved recognition and wanted to prove himself, but he lacked the patience and genuine effort. He was weak, unwilling to face the difficulties of reality, and instead turned to easy, wrongful paths like gambling and partying. When cornered by debt and pressure from his lover, greed and selfishness rose strongly. Linfeng lacked healthy problem-solving skills, didn't know how to seek help, and chose the most negative and destructive path. This case was the explosive culmination of long-suppressed negative emotions, combined with a loss of control at a decisive moment. Regarding Dong Manting's role, it is clear she was not the direct mastermind of the murder. However, it cannot be denied that Manting was a crucial catalyst, a professional gold digger and psychological manipulator. With her beautiful appearance, charming demeanor, and sweet words, Manting easily identified and exploited Linfeng's psychological weaknesses. She constantly filled his head with fantasies of a rich and comfortable life, while simultaneously applying financial pressure. Manting took advantage of Linfeng's gullibility, weakness, and his craving for love and recognition to turn him into a tool for her own material purposes. Although Manting may not have anticipated that Linfeng would act so brutally, her actions contributed significantly to pushing him down the path of crime, making the tragedy inevitable. The victim in this case, Madame Zhang Yui, is a tragic and pitiable figure. Although described as strict, conservative, and even somewhat domineering in family decisions, it cannot be denied that her actions stemmed from a love for her grandchildren in her own way, from a desire to protect and grow the family business, and from her experiences and traditional values. Her strictness was, perhaps, an effort to discipline Linfeng, to pull him back from his mistakes. But her methods, in an era of rapid economic change where old and new values clashed, may have been outdated and even caused unintended harm. The tragic death of Madame Zhang Yui is the climax of broken family relationships, generational conflict, and the erosion of traditional moral values in the face of the temptation of money and an individual's moral degradation. The boundless sympathy for the victim, and the utmost revulsion and disgust for the perpetrator's actions, are the common feelings of all who followed this case. The deliberation is over. The presiding judge, with a stern face, begins to read the verdict. The entire courtroom is silent. The air in the courtroom thickened as the presiding judge, in a firm and clear voice, read every word of the final verdict. Based on the facts of the case, the evidence examined in court, and the testimonies of the defendants and related parties, the Judicial Council finds. Defendant Zhang Linfeng, driven by selfish motives, personal dissatisfaction, and boundless greed, committed illegal home invasion, and assaulted and caused the death of the victim, Madame Zhang Yui, who was his biological grandmother and had a duty of care towards the defendant. After committing the crime, the defendant deliberately set a fire to destroy property and conceal the evidence of his crime. The actions of defendant Zhang Linfeng constitute the crime of murder, under Article 232 of the 1997 Criminal Law of the People's Republic of China, with aggravating circumstances including killing a relative, killing a person for whom he had a duty of care, and committing the crime in a savage and brutal manner. Furthermore, the defendant's act of arson constitutes the crime of intentional destruction of property, under Article 275. The defendant's actions are exceptionally heinous, have caused public outrage, and he must be permanently removed from society. After a brief pause, the presiding judge declared, "The Foshan Municipal People's Court has decided to sentence defendant Zhang Linfeng to death for the crime of murder, and 10 years in prison for the crime of intentional destruction of property." The combined final sentence is death. As for Dong Manting, the court found that the defendant took advantage of Zhang Linfeng's trust for personal gain, knew of Linfeng's criminal intent but did not prevent it, and later consumed property obtained from Linfeng's crime and attempted to flee. The court sentences Dong Manting to 18 years in prison for the crimes of fraud by abuse of confidence and concealment of a crime. For Ji Xiaosheng, the court determined that the defendant provided tools for Linfeng to commit the crime and failed to report the crime. The court sentences Ji Xiaosheng to 4 years in prison for the crimes of concealment of a crime and failure to report a crime. Upon hearing the death sentence, Zhang Linfeng collapsed to the floor. His legs gave out, and his whole body trembled. His face was ashen, drained of all color. Judicial police had to lift him up. Dong Manting wailed hysterically, repeatedly proclaiming her innocence and begging for mercy, but it was all too late. Linfeng's relatives, if present, likely could not contain their cries of pain and despair. The tragedy of a family had reached its conclusion with the harshest sentences of the law. The Zhang Yui case closed, leaving behind countless reflections and bitter lessons. It serves as a profound warning about the dangers of misguided indulgence or, conversely, excessive strictness without understanding in raising children, which can lead to personality disorders. It shows how the pressure of money and a materialistic, hedonistic lifestyle can corrupt people, pushing them into unimaginable criminal acts. The case is also a reminder of the importance of identifying and dealing with personal psychological issues, insecurities, and inferiority complexes before they become the seeds of crime. A single impulsive moment, a wrong decision driven by selfishness and a loss of control, can destroy a lifetime and cause indelible pain to family, loved ones, and society. The trial ended. Zhang Zhouyuan quietly left the courtroom, his face filled with a deep sadness. A few days later, he was seen alone, offering incense at the grave of Madame Zhang Yui. The new mound of earth had not yet grown green with grass. Zhouyuan stood there for a long time, his gaze distant, holding not only the pain of losing a relative, but also a silent resolve, a determination to rebuild what was lost, not just the material fortune his grandmother left behind, but more importantly, to try to heal the family values that had been wounded and sullied by the recent tragedy. The unholy fire in Foshan that year has been extinguished, but the lessons it left behind will smolder forever in the memories of those who remain.